Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom. Pastor Wilkins, chasing our history and the sons of Yah. Shalom, shalom, shalom. Amen. Gospel or fulfillment of the law. Some things are important. Some things are important. Gospel or fulfillment of the law. My brother, Joe, what's up, man? Bodybuilder. Fashion model, what's up with you, man? Amen. Gospel or fulfillment of the law. History is what I do. I can report to you from history with at least an 85% certainty because nothing's absolute. With colonization, there is no absolute. So I would say with at least an 85% accuracy, I can report to you that the gospel is a 2nd century term. Meaning the apostles would have never heard the term. The Messiah would have never heard the term. The historical writers of the 1st century would have never heard the term. Yet we are hung and caught up in preaching the gospel. Some folks say, well, it's just a term, Pastor. Some terms are deadly. Period. Period. It's a term for manipulation. Because after 70 AD, we deal with manipulation a lot. Not a little bit, a lot. So what are you saying, Pastor Wilkins? We are taught, preach the gospel. I taught the gospel. I preached the gospel for 25 years before my awakening. There is a confusion, even amongst Judah. See, I'm different from a lot of people. You say Israel, I say Judah. Until the two sticks are healed, I say Judah. Because at the current time, Judah and Israel are not together. Period. Isaiah tells us this. For I shall gather the dispersed of Israel, one, and what? I mean the outcast of Israel, I shall gather the outcast of Israel, one, Isaiah 11, 12 through 14, and the dispersed of Judah, two. So Judah and Israel, though our indigenous roots are Israel, Judah and Israel are not together at this time. They are in a split, a marital split, because Yah created them to be. So they basically in a marital split. But when you say gospel or fulfillment of the law, where do we lose our way? What are we talking about? I can testify to you as a 25-year gospel preacher. I do not preach the gospel. I preach the fulfillment of the law. And I can prove it through the scriptures and with history. Yes, I agree, Sister Ann. One day they will be together again. The restoration of Israel is going to happen. And we got to quit thinking a remnant means a couple thousand people. A remnant can be in the billions based on the time of man's creation alone. It can be in the billions. We don't know. But to talk about the gospel and understand the fulfillment of the law is two separate things. I taught the gospel for 25 years. And in the 25 years, Old Testament, New Testament, we were taught to eliminate the law. What did they take from the slaves at the Atlantic slave trade? The customs of the law. The practice of the Sabbath. I can run off pope after pope that was fighting the law from 321 AD until now, endorsing everything but the law, the Catholic Church. 321. Everybody say Constantine said that the Sabbath would be on Sunday and not Saturday. Constantine can't say that without Pope Sylvester. Do your research, check your history. Who was the Pope 321? Who was the Pontifex Maximus 321? Pope Sylvester. You're not getting that past the Senate, that Christianity will be the religion of Rome without a Pontifex Maximus, because he's the only one who can endorse spiritual law in the Roman Empire without Senate approval. The only one. So understand, it's important to have history when you try to understand the books, because the books are history. So you're not understanding the books without history. When you deal with Acts, you're dealing with the apostles, you're dealing with on-time knowledge. When you deal with us, you're dealing with the books of Acts, and you need the element of history. Lest you be confused. And history tells us the Roman imperiums, the siege on Jerusalem, the Jewish wars, volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All these books tell us that the siege on Jerusalem, 70 AD, that Titus, the Messiah, calls it out. He says, and you are to stand in the holy place. What was he saying? He was talking about 70 AD, and he was telling you that the high priest would die in the Holy of Holies. Why? There were 3 walls to Jerusalem. It was fortified through 3 walls. It was just like the outer court, the inner court, and the holiest of holy at the Temple of Solomon. Exact same layout. You had the outer court, the common people. You had the inner court where the military might was at. And you had that sacred place, the Holy of Holies, behind the 3rd wall. First wall, common place. Second wall, military might. 3rd wall, the Holy of Holies. And when the Messiah says in the book of Luke, they are to stand in that holy place, he's talking about the high priest, the Levite priest would perish in that holy place, behind that 3rd wall. And they perished behind that 3rd wall, exactly like how Mashiach said they would. The Romans recorded everything. The Romans recorded everything. Hear that. Now, watch this. So we know that Titus stood behind the veil. We know this because Titus makes this statement. He says, I find in their temple that they are a people of an invisible God, and he appears to be one. This is what Titus says. This is what history records. So he's knowing that he's in a place that's like nothing else in the Roman Empire. Hear that. Now, hear what he does. So now he's behind there, and what does he do? He begins to steal the things, not of Jerusalem, but the things of the temple. Big difference. If you look at the Ark of Titus today, then you find on that ark that you will see the menorah, the showbread table, and many of the things that's behind that veil of the Holy of Holies where the high priest perished. And Titus brings the menorah and all these things out. Now, watch this. He also brings out the Holy Scripts. What was those Holy Scripts is the question. Revelation gives us the answer. Paul gives us the answer. The Messiah gives us the answer to what those Holy Scripts were. If you listening to the Scriptures properly, they give you the answer. Be careful. This is shocking to hear this from me because I taught the gospel for 25 years and realized I was wrong. Why did you realize you was wrong, Pastor Wilkins? Because I started doing the history and understood the gospel is a 2nd century term. Wait a minute, they saying the word gospel themselves in the script. They not saying it. It's being recorded and rewritten that they saying it. They can't say it because it's not a term until the 2nd century. What was they writing? What was he preaching? What were they representing? The mysteries in the scripts. Bottom line. Now, watch this. So when you have the Flavian dynasty, you have Vespasian, and you have Titus, the major players of 70 AD, as well as a Hellenized Jew who was known as Tiberius Alexandria, who the Romans record as the greatest Hebrew warrior in human history. That's what they record. He's the one that takes down what? Jerusalem in 70 AD. Titus himself is insufficient because Vespasian is on his way back to where? To Rome to be crowned as the emperor as the battle is about to kick off. Now, watch this. What happened to Nero? Nero is the last of the what? Julio-Claudian dynasty emperors. All 5 emperors were what? Popes. Hear that. If all 5 emperors were Pontifex Maximus, which history records they were, from Augustus to Nero, that whole dynasty were emperors. Now, watch the manipulation. This is why I do history. We must be careful. Watch this. They say Peter was the first pope. Peter dies around 62, 64 AD. Yet Nero does not die until around 68 AD. We know Nero was a Pontifex Maximus, and there's only one at one time in ancient Rome, so he's the pope. There's no way Peter could have been a pope for the mere fact the whole dynasty of the Claudian Julio dynasty were Pontifex Maximus. That's all of Peter's lifetime. So all of his lifetime, there was a pope in Rome. Peter could not have been the first pope. So we understand this lie through history. The gospel is also a lie. The term gospel is also a lie. But it's a calculated lie to take you away from what? The fulfillment of the law. If you change the term, which the what? The fathers of the 2nd century church did, they changed the term, and then they put apostolic names on those 4 anonymous books, because the books did not have names. So they put apostolic names on those books, and the books received power. Why? Because when you're dealing with the apostles, they were so popular that you could not kill them like that. You could not kill their legacy. You could not kill their work. The Messiah, Rome could not kill the Messiah. I know that's what you hear. That is not the truth. He was killed by who? His own. The councils of his own killed him. Rome would not kill him. If you study history, that would have been detriment to Rome. The scriptures say the crowds were so massive. We're talking massive, million-man march crowds followed this man. So if they would have killed him, the rebels of Judah would have rose up and war would have broke out on epic levels in Rome. That's the #1 problem I need you to hear from history. The concern of the Flavian dynasty was the Messiah, and were these rebels fighting us based on that Hebrew Messiah? And if they are, they will be fighting us from here until the end of the empire. The Flavians was concerned about rebel Jews. How do we stop these rebels from fighting us? We have to take them serious because of 66 AD. The battle at that outpost called Beth Hara, where 6,000 Romans perished to the rebel Jews in that battle. So we have to take them serious. The Flavian dynasty knows these people have to be taken serious. There's so many rebel wars, there's so many rebel battles that break out between Judah and the Romans that it was ridiculous. Now I'm going to give you a clue from the battles. There was a battle that took place at night after the Battle of Beth Hara, where the Jewish rebels were fighting the Romans in the Romans' armor. The Romans they could not identify them based on their clothing because they was in the exact same clothing. There's only one way to identify those rebels. Their skin was a different color than the Romans. Hear that. They did not have the same skin colors. Because guess what? In that skirmish, the Romans were killing them based on their identity of skin and not based on their identity of military warfare. Because Judah was not wearing their military warfare. They were wearing the Romans' warfare. So there's only one way to find out who we fighting. You would have had to have looked at their skin color, the complexion of their hair. So there's tea leaves and a clue all throughout the Roman history that tells you who these people are. It's like the Quito War. Where did they fight? The history tells us in the wars of the Jews that they fought outside of the province of Judea, which would have been Jerusalem, and it was recorded as Northern Africa. Hear that. This is where Trajan defeated those rebel Jews. Hear that. Now let's deal with this word. Is it the gospel or the fulfillment of the law? Hear this. Watch this. Now, so they get the Holy Scripts. Titus takes the Holy Scripts. What else does Titus do according to history? Josephus records that Titus then burns all the other copies of those scripts. The siege on Jerusalem records Titus commands those copies to be burned. So we know all the Holy Scripts were burned except one copy that would have been in the hands of Pope Linus or Pope who? It's got to either be Linus. Matter of fact, it was Linus. It had to be in Linus because the Claudian dynasty was over. It's either Linus or Pope Clemens. Scholars fight on who was that pope in 70 AD. Some say Linus, and there's a lot of reason for the Catholics to say Linus because there's a reference to a man named Linus in the scriptures by Paul. So that's why the Catholics endorse Linus. Other historians have endorsed Clemens as that pope in 70 AD that got his hands on those holy scripts. What did the Romans have? History records Josephus was on their side. But Josephus did not flip in 70 AD. Josephus flipped in 66 AD. But there were also some Hebrew-speaking Greek, generals who were flipped as well from Judah, who would have known the interpretation of those scripts. Hear that. Now, so they kept so many, and then also what we have to understand that we never talk about, there were a few high priests that were taken into captivity. They all wasn't burned in the church. A few of them, for the zealotness of Rome, were taken into captivity. They were tortured to translate those holy scripts. Understand the philosophy. It's important to understand the emperorship of history when you're dealing with the scripts, because you have to place the philosophy of that emperor into play. What was the philosophy of who? Of Vespasian. He had two things you have to hear. One, he believed in what? The Suave Terralia. What was the Suave Terralia? History records that Vespasian used the Suave Terralia when he defeated his enemy. And that's to cleanse that land of all that religion. That word religion they would have used would have been the word superstition. So when you hear Paul says to them on Mars Hill, "You're too religious for me," he's saying you're too superstitious for me. This is what Paul is saying. So the mere fact that we know Vespasian would have performed the Suave Terralia after 70 AD, then that means the books are now obsolete. They're no more as far as Rome's concerned. But Rome has a problem. Those Judah rebels are dangerous and they're gifted fighters. 70 AD does not settle the war. They fought for 3 more years into 73 AD. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But they fought 3 more years in into that war. Now, what do they have? They have the possession of what? Judah's historians who can translate the books. Now, we understand, and let's take it into what the Messiah said as soon as I show you the second philosophy. The first philosophy of the Romans under the what? FLAVIN dynasty is the suave terralia. We cleanse in all this land, and they do it for 5 years. They cleanse that land. So that land is guarded by Roman soldiers and those who they hire, and they're cleansing that land of those people. Hear that. So Jerusalem is being totally cleansed of all Judah's history. Hear that. Vespasian was known to perform the suave terralia. The Greeks were known to perform the suave terralia. And they laid the pig at the altar to say Zeus is God. That was the importance of laying the pig at the altar, to say Zeus is God. If you study the Maccabees, then you hear before they rise to power, it was what? They denigrated, they desecrated the what? The altar by laying a pig at the altar. That was to say Zeus is God. And that's what they were doing. They were establishing Zeus as Jerusalem's God. Understand that. Now, so we understand that's the first philosophy of the Flavian dynasty. The second philosophy is rarely heard, which we need to hear. Typology. The what? The Roman historians, they type 40 years back into the past and 40 years into the future. What was that to do? To totally manipulate the off-seed of the people of the Jews of 70 AD so they can recreate the mindset of Judah, because Judah was dangerous. So what did they do? They took their books. They did exactly what Ptolemy did in what? In Alexandria, Egypt in 330. He did what? He took their books. He made the what? Bishops of Memphis translate the books, or you die. You translate them or you die. That's what he did. And the Romans did the same thing to a few high priests and Jewish historians. They then found anybody of good intelligence who could write the history of the Jews, and they persecuted and assassinated them too. So intelligent people who were scholars, they also died, even though they had nothing to do with the war, because the Flavians was covering all angles of this war. So what happened? For 3 years, they were killing off Judah's writers, and at least they rewrite the history of Jerusalem, because they're going to rewrite it themselves as the Flavians. You see this same system. It worked in what? Hellenization, and it worked into colonization. Hear that. What do? They rewrite who you are. So the Flavian dynasty used the 80-year window, and they totally rewrote who Judah was. Hear that. That is important to understand. So they used typology on the scripts. Hear that. They didn't stop at typology. This practice would carry out through what? The Pontifex Maximuses of the later 1st century into the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th century. Typology has always been placed over our books. So where you see the word gospel, you should really be seeing the testimony of the Messiah. How do we know that? Revelation tells us this. What does the Revelation tell us? John said, he said he spoke of the testimony of the Messiah, and that testimony was prophecy. Hear that. So that means I now need the Ruach Hadah, because in order to understand it, you're going to have the spirit of truth, because some manipulation has happened. That's what John is telling you when he talks about the testimony of the Messiah, and the testimony of the Messiah is prophecy. So we have this record in Revelation from John. Hear that. Now, what was happening, Pastor? They did typology over the scripture. So when you hear the Gospels came out in 66 AD to 110, let's say the book of Mark came out. Let's say they're right, and it came out in 66 AD. It came out under typology. So it really did not come out in 66 AD. It would have came out in 106 AD, because it's 40 years into the future but it was written back 40 years into the past. So what does that say? It was most likely written in 106 AD, and the Flavians backdated it to 66 AD. That's the Flavian philosophy of typology. We have history that the Flavians were gifted at this. It was a propaganda that effectively worked. Daniel told you this was happening. This is what Daniel was talking about. For they seek to change the dates and the time. You keep focusing in on Constantine, but the problem with the dates and the time happens with the Flavians. They changed the dates and the times. So now you have this testimony of the Messiah in 66 AD, and that they erased the testimony of the Messiah that happened at around 30 AD because they was erasing the Hebrew Messiah himself. And then you get tea leaves of this typology. Love your enemy and forgive your enemy. That's not the law. The law says if you trespass against a man, you owe something for that forgiveness. So that would not have been the Messiah saying, because that's not the law. Also, when you hear, give unto Caesar what is Caesar, it's not talking about Octavius. It's talking about give unto Caesar as a god. The Hamashiach would never tell you to pay homage to another, what? Another god. So that also is typology. But you need history to look at these things they call the Gospels, and then the typology jumps out at you. So because I study this, and I study it so in-depthly, I know when I'm reading typology in those 4 letters that are not written by Mark, John, Peter, or Luke. The only one that the Ebionites even endorsed was John. The other letters they discredited. This is what the Ebionites said. The Catholics erased them, but the problem was the 2nd century bishop of Lyons, he rewrites about them. He wrote what? And we know he took his influence from who? Polycarp. Who was Polycarp? He was a Jewish historian who sit at the feet of John. I know I'm putting a lot out here at you, but please try to understand what I'm saying. So he's influenced by who? Polycarp, who is the only historian that sat at the feet of an apostle. Hear that. So now, what are we dealing with? So we're dealing with the book of John, and then this Bishop of Lyons, he writes about the Ebionites. What does he say? He tells how the Ebionites were in the area of the Messiah, and they were what? Law keepers. They didn't eat no meat. They followed the strict diet of the dietary law. And this is what they said about that Hebrew Messiah. They said he was perfect in the law. That's what they said. So they were telling you that this man maintained the law unto perfection. Understand what happens next. So what we understand now is this typology is all over the testimony of the Messiah. So if it was no term gospel in the 2nd century, what would the apostles have been calling it? What would have been the term? Let's look at the scriptures. Watch this. The Messiah tells you out of his own mouth what it would have been called. We have to pay attention to the scripts. Is this true? So when you hear this statement, I come not to destroy the law, can we find reference that would make that true? Let's look and see. Let's go to the scriptures and let's let the scriptures speak for themselves. If you look at Matthew 5 and what? I believe it's Matthew 5 and 17. Is that scripture typology or is that scripture true? Because the Flavians did not totally destroy the books. That would have caused an all-out war. They did something very unique. Typology. They put them 40 years back in the past and 40 years into the future. So if you say the first book of the gospel came out in 66 AD, no, it came out in 106 AD based on Flavian typology. Watch this. 17th verse. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. So he says he came to fulfill the law. That's what that says. But is that true? Because of typology, you must be critical of these 4 books. Typology of the Flavians make you say, is that true? You have every right to say, is that true? But the Messiah, being the advanced master builder, he knew He knew through the Father that we must send the Spirit of truth, because a lot of stuff that will be measured by written has been manipulated. He understood that. That's why you have the Spirit of truth. It's to quicken you to question certain things that you think you're seeing. Like if you look at Genesis under the Greek Septuagint, and you look at it under the KJV, then you're going to hear they was in Egypt for 130 years. But you will hear it in the Greek Septuagint, 215 Canaan, 215 Egypt. The Greek Septuagint also, the 15th chapter, you'll hear they afflicted them 400 years, and then you get this phony doctrine called the wing doctrine, because Ishmael afflicted Isaac, so that's when the 400 years started, which is a phony doctrine, because the persons that teach that don't know history. So now when you get the Greek Septuagint, it says they afflicted them, enslaved them, and humbled them. The exact principle of who? The colonial powers. They enslave you, they afflict you, then they enslave you, and they humble you. Give me an example in history, Pastor Wilkins. They marched them into the slave dungeons, and they were being afflicted 3 to 4 months right there at the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the door of no return. They're being afflicted 3 or 4 months to become Christians before they get on those ships. They do not put them on the ships until they understand that their religion has been changed through affliction. Then they enslaved them. It wasn't they made them do it when they got here. They was doing it before the ship. They afflicted them, then they enslaved them, and then they took them into the new world and humbled them to a new culture. That's exactly what the Greek Septuagint says. That did not happen in Egypt. That happened at the Atlantic slave trade. Hear that. That's why the Greek Septuagint is so important, dealing with the 400-year prophecy. Now, he says, I come not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Is there a reference point that we can base that off of? Let's go to the book of Corinth. Join me in the book of 1 Corinth, if you would. I believe I'm in 1 Corinth. Let me make sure I got it right. 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter. Let's look at the 14th verse. 1 Corinthians 15:14. If Hamashiach be not risen, then our preaching and your faith is in vain. What is the fulfillment of the law? The law's not fulfilled until he resurrects. There is no, because what was wrong with the law? Let's see what Paul said was wrong with the law. Paul did not say the law was over. He told you what was wrong with the law without Hamashiach. What does Paul say? You got to realize, I used to teach against the law. I know the law. Watch this. What does he say about the law? Paul, what do you say? Let's look at Romans 8. What did you say in Romans 8 in the 3rd verse? For what the law could not do, in that it was weak. What made the law weak? It had no power over sin. It did not nullify the law. It made it weak. But what happened? Yah sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh. He tells you the problem with the law. It had no power over sin. He's not saying the law is dead. He's not saying the law is weak. He's not saying it's over. He said the weakness of the law is that death was greater. That's what he's telling you. So the law cannot be fulfilled until the Hamashiach conquers death himself. That's why Paul tells you in 1 Corinthians, if he not a resurrected, he did not say a thing about gospel, this or that. He's telling you what the message was. He's telling you the testimony of the Messiah, which was prophecy. Why was his message prophecy, Pastor Wilkins? Because Isaiah prophesied he prophesied his life. So the testimony of the Messiah is prophecy. Watch this. He said, but Yah sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh for sin condemned in the flesh. He condemned sin that you can be free and walk freely in the law in the spirit. Watch this. Not in your flesh, because your flesh can't walk in the law. You got to walk in the law in the spirit. That's the fulfillment of the law. To walk in the law in the spirit. Watch this. That the righteousness of law of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Many Torah teachers are teaching the law after the flesh and not after the Spirit, because they don't have the testimony of the Messiah, which is prophecy. That's why they still struggle with Deuteronomy 28. That's why they struggle with the 400-year prophecy, because they don't have the testimony of the Messiah that these prophecies are dealing with. Hear that. Now let's go back and let's what Paul says again. Let's go to 1 Corinthians again, and let's look at that scripture all over again from Paul. Paul says, had he not arisen, watch this, 14th verse, 1 Corinthians 15:14. Let's look at the 13th verse. But if there be no resurrection of the dead, then Hamashiach has not risen. If Hamashiach did not defeat death, then the law is not fulfilled. So Paul now was teaching the resurrection, which would be the fulfillment of the law. Hear that. So where you get gospel terms is from these Edomites who sought to kill the law. I've been on plantation after plantation after plantation where they will explain to you the way they took the heritage of our people was by killing the customs of who? By killing the customs of those Jews that they were enslaving. And what were those customs? The Portuguese who did the slave raids first in 1444, they testified to the British that these people were keeping the Sabbath on a different day, and they buried their people away from their civilization. They were testifying that these people were keeping the Sabbath so strictly that they would not even work or trade on that day. And their trading was huge because you had the Sahara trade routes. This is why history is important, because it's gray areas that can only be filled in through history. Hear that. So now what do we understand? Paul's telling you he was teaching the resurrection, which would have been the fulfillment of the law. How do you know that's the fulfillment of the law? He tells you again, Romans 8:3. Listen what Paul says. For what the law could not do, in it was weak through the flesh. What will happen? The Christian apologists will say the law was weak. Yes, they right to a certain extent, but they wrong totally at the end. Watch this. Yah, he fixed the solution. Yah sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, condemn sin in the flesh. You can't keep the law in the flesh. Hamashiach knew all those years of the law. It's not possible for man to keep the law in the flesh. Man must keep the law in the spirit. Hear that. That needs to be a deeper conversation in the community, because there's a lot of flesh teaching Torah in the community that totally ignores that verse. Though the Christian apologists use it, we ignore it out of misunderstanding, because we think if we read it, it gives them the upper hand. No, it kills their argument if you know how to put concept on concept. So what does he say? He sent his son into the sinful flesh. Watch this. For the good, watch this, excuse me there. 4th verse, for the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled. So he's clearly doing what he said he would do. Fulfill the law. Now, Paul tells you what that fulfillment is again. 13th verse, 1 Corinthians 15:13. But if there be no resurrection, because if he don't defeat death, which is what makes the law weak, then the law is no more, because we have no sacrifice that can fix that problem. Hear that. And this is where these camps, non-Messianic camps, get confused, and our people get confused, because even though we say Hamashiach, we don't keep the testimony, because we try to shove the law down people's throat in the flesh. Like a lot of us ain't nothing but Ashkenazi Jew teachers. What do you mean? 613 laws. You didn't get that from the Hamashiach. You did not get that from the apostles. You got that from the Ashkenazi Jew. The first 5 books of the Torah, You didn't get that from Hamashiach. You didn't get that from the apostles. You didn't get that from the prophets. You got that from who? You got it from the Ashkenazi Jew. Many folks who are teaching the Torah, they will never, they're our Torah teachers. Here's what you need to do. Let me be real with you. Now that I taught you all that, let me bring you a deep revelation you need to understand. If they're going to teach you the Torah, you make them be Judah teachers as well. What do you mean be Judah teachers as well? You make them teach that the awakening is for Judah because Israel was not asleep. The awakening is about Judah. And because a lot of your Torah teachers will teach you we Israel, but they won't teach you we Judah. Well, if we Israel, what is the awakening for? It's Judah that was in the land of their captors that had to remember themselves. Hear that. What does Isaiah tell us again? Isaiah 11 and 12. For the what? The outcast of Israel and the dispersed of Judah. So we know Judah is the ones that need to be awakened in the land of their captivity. So when your Torah teachers teach, you make them teach the fulfillment of the law. And if they're teaching the awakening, they need to teach we Judah. Because there's brothers like, what is his name? Ralph Messer, who teaches we Israel. Meaning we are Ephraim or someone like that. Understand what I'm saying? Why? Because I encountered an Ashkenazi Jew that told me I was his brother, but it was based on being another tribe other than Judah. I encountered him. He was a historian on a slave plantation. And I broke him off a piece of knowledge and walked away from him. And the people he was teaching the history to, who was white folks, followed me to my video. So it left him standing there doing speed dial through his phone. I testify a truth that First Lady Wilkins will tell you it happened exactly that way. He was the head of the Ashkenazi Jews on that plantation. Understand that. Well, if you in the Atlantic slave trade, you're equivalent to Judah and when they were the kingdom. What does that mean? Levites and Benjaminites were not by the bloodline, but because they was with Judah, they were classified as Judah. If you came through that Atlantic slave trade, you might have been from another tribe, but you're Judah because of that suffering. That suffering at Deuteronomy 28, when you start dealing with that 68th verse, is Judah. When you start dealing with that 49th verse, that's Judah. When you start dealing with that 48th verse, that's Judah. When you start dealing with that 36th verse, that's Babylon, because they took the king into Babylonian captivity and they killed him. So that's Babylon, because Deuteronomy is a totality of our captivities. It's not one captivity. It tells us of many captivities. When you hear that yoke of iron, that's not Jeremiah. That's Judah. Y'all placed the yoke of iron up on, it was a yoke of wood on Jeremiah's neck, and the prophet Hannah broke the yoke of wood. So now y'all places a yoke of iron. But the intent was a yoke of wood. The intent of your enemy was a yoke of iron. Everybody at the Atlantic slave trade that was not converted to Christian before getting on those ships, they were placed in a yoke of iron because they were not humble enough. So now we got to discipline them in the new world. They identified rebellious slaves through the yoke of iron because the principle was three things. To inflict them. They afflicted them in them dungeons before putting them on them ships. Some of them went through that affliction 3 to 4 months upwards to a year to get on those ships, because many ships coming to get them were either lost or they were destroyed at sea. So they stayed there longer under that affliction. The second thing, after the affliction at the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, at the door of no return, then the affliction turns to the enslavement of them once they're on the ship, and the affliction continues. Why? They were raping our women up top, they were molesting our children up top, and we were at the bottom dying from bloody flux. Look up bloody flux, do your research, and bloody flux was wiping our people out at the bottom of those ships. So that affliction and enslavement intertwine. Once they got you to the new world, they taught you the new way of religion. They gave you a new name and they gave you a new culture. That was to humble you into your slavery. So when you hear the prophecy in Genesis 15 and 13 from the Greek Septuagint, it mentions all three of these conditions that you suffered at the Atlantic slave trade. That's not an accident. We must preach the awakening of Judah, and we must preach it from the testimony of the fulfillment of the law of Hamashiach. That's not excluding nobody. The Edomite excluded everybody. We didn't cause the awakening. They caused the awakening. And it's us that have to awake under the fulfillment of the law as Judah. What are you saying as Judah? As the conditions that Judah faced based on the prophecy. That's all I'm trying to tell you. If your teachers are going to teach the awakening, they must teach Judah. Judah is the one that was asleep. And they must teach the fulfillment of the law, because that is our customs and heritage. Hear that. Paul's preaching the what? The fulfillment of the law after they were first called Christian in Antioch. They're first called Christian in Antioch in what? Acts, the 11th chapter, the 26th verse. But that does not, the 11th chapter, precede the 13th chapter, where we find Paul at Antioch, and he's teaching what? The law, the fulfillment of the law, and what? And the prophets. So that tells us that the gospel was not our message. You have to understand. When we hear the term gospel, that's typology. The Flavians invented typology over the script. But history also tells us it ain't just the Flavians. Our people guilty too. The Alexandria family had historians who was taking Greek mythology and placing that Greek mythology over the law right there in Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem. History proved some of the most gifted historians were what? They were what? They were Hellenized Jews who had the mindset of a Greek. Hear that. We see that with Tiberius Alexander. He's killing all his brothers who is Jews, and Tiberius Alexandria is a Jew, but he has the mind of a Greek. And that's what's going on with Christianity. It's never changed. You see our people teaching the word with the mind of a Greek. Even in the awakening, you see our people teaching the word with the mind of a Greek. But Yah says, I'm going to raise up that prophet that's going to tell you, put the history with the scripts so that you can break the mind of that Greek. And I understand a prophet has no honor in his homeland. What does that mean? He has no honor amongst his people. That's why I'm under moral attack even as I speak, because I tell you to put the history with the scripts. I heard something that armed me the other night. We was on a platform, and the brother said that that verse dealing with this is for revenge is twofold. It's not twofold. The subject matter is the Romans are coming, and the revenge that the Messiah is talking about. He's prophesying 70 AD, and that revenge is the Battle of Beth Hara that sparked that whole war of 70 AD. Because we didn't just defeat them, we took their military might, and we took their Aquila. Look up the Aquila, because I can't really get deep in it. It's deep. But we had their Aquila, we had their artillery, we had their catapults, we had their shields, we had their swords, and they were sitting behind the second wall. Where was the greatest fight in the war of 70 AD? That second wall, because the Romans realized they was fighting their own artillery behind that second wall, and it was hard to breach that wall. It took Hamites to go in there as spies and tell them the weakest positions behind that wall. That's why the Messiah said, when you see armies surround Jerusalem, not just an army, it's an S on the end, because the Hamites fought with them as well. Hear that today. History matters. It matters. But I'm that messenger of history, and I'm under more attack than any. And folks will say, well, it's because you can't get along with Morays. No, Morays ain't receiving history matters, period. That's why we deliver. Let me show you something. There are Ashkenazis that teach the Torah. Ralph Messer, to be one. What did Ralph Messer do? He went before who? Bishop Eddie Long, after he raped those boys, because he raped them, all four men got the same testimony. After he raped those boys, what did he do? He lifted him up on this chariot, and he told the people of New Birth, this is a prince of Israel, not Judah, because he believes he's Judah, but he believes you some of the people, but you are the prince of Israel. That's what they teach. I spoke with an Ashkenazi Jew. Again, that's a historian. He don't mind us saying that we the people of the book, as long as we don't say we Judah. And there's Torah teachers right now in the awakening that teach Israel, but they will not pronounce you as Judah because they under the Ashkenazi's Torah teaching, period. The law and the gospel. Which one is right? I laid out the history. I gave you the receipts. He that have an ear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to your assembly. Research it and tell me when I'm lying. Pastor Wilkins of the Sons of Yah and Chasing Our History.